Hello and welcome back to the Drop Step podcast. It's 2 episodes in 2 days for me, and this is the one that I was really looking forward to because I'm putting my GM cap on. Andrew, you've literally got your GM cap on. I'm excited. You're wearing the baseball cap. We are talking team building today, and we're talking about the one, the only Anthony Edwards. Guys, for those of you who don't know, Andrew Dukowitz, credentialed writer for the Minnesota Timberwolves. I sort of found him pre-draft, pre-credentials.
Mm-hmm.
You were working for the Lynx, and it's worked a treat. I've got inside info on every Wolves. I've got him just, it's like a rookie scale extension kind of thing. Just a great deal that's working out, and I'm so happy to have him back on the podcast. Andrew, how are you doing? How are you feeling about today's episode?
Appreciate it, man. I'm excited. It's the Wolves season has been a little chaotic. We'll say that, to say the least. But Anthony Edwards is he's taken another leap, and I think because the Wolves season has been a little meandering, that it's gone a little under the radar. He's shooting threes at a Steph Curry rate, and he's making them at a Steph Curry rate. So he is now just Steph Curry.
Yeah, 6'6" Steph Curry, dunk of the year, Steph Curry, all that jazz. It's a really, really interesting one to talk about. And yeah, like you said, I really think Ant-Man has flown under the radar this year because the Wolves haven't quite had the regular season success that they had last year because of this big Karl Anthony Towns trade. It feels like the tenor of the conversation has very much been, why did they split up this team? Julius Randle's a horrible fit. What are we meant to do? But quietly, they're sort of rounding into form. But today, as interested as we are in the current Minnesota Timberwolves, Andrew, I pitch this to you as you're the GM of Minnesota and you're essentially trying to win a title in the next 5 years, and you want him to be his best self while he does it. So what we're going to talk about is building the perfect team around Anthony Edwards, and that's going to involve some difficult decisions. But just to really zoom into the player that Ant is today, give us a little flavor of what you've been watching on a night-to-night basis, because like the stats read one way, but how is it to be in the building?
I mean, he just from like a vibe standpoint, like that kid owns the entire state of Minnesota. Like he is beloved by the fan base. He enjoys being here. He seems to be like a really good teammate. Him and the coach get along super well. Like he's just a great guy to cover in general. I mean, coming into this season after the Towns trade, everyone had kind of said, this season is going to be dependent on Anthony Edwards. Like how much of a leap does he make? How impactful can he be? And I think what's frustrating in the Wolves organization is Anthony Edwards has done exactly that. I mean, he is shooting 9.8 threes per game at 42.3%. He is still getting to the free throw line 5 times a game. He's 26 points per game, 4.5 assists. His rebounding is solid at just under 6 a game. His turnovers have gone up a little bit. That's because he has been the primary creator for the most of the season. I think for the Wolves this year, what's kind of been disappointing for Anthony Edwards is Mike Conley came into the year with a thumb injury, and really up until he got benched mid-January, he has been playing really pretty poor. Rudy Gobert seems to have potentially regressed. It could be just the Randle fit and where the team is with not having Mike out there, but Rudy has regressed. Jaden McDaniels, at one point, he was shooting 14% on corner threes, and he shot 43% last year. Like almost everything that the wheels could come off for this team just has. And meanwhile, that has happened. And because Anthony Edwards is now shooting at a historic level, he's still playing defense really well. He's still slashing. He's still one of the best isolation players in the league. Because he has all of that, this team is, I think 6 games over 500 at the time of recording, playing the Wizards tonight, and they're still kind of in that playoff mix. I think for, fans of the Wolves that are coming, maybe just checking in now because the Super Bowl's coming around the corner, and America's a very one sport at a time type of country. So attention needs to be shifted. I think as fans come back to this team now, they're going to see a pretty fun team. Jaden's playing really good lately. Dante, his foot injury isn't as long as it was expected to be. Julius has been fitting in a lot better the last couple of weeks. And Anthony Edwards is, 2 days ago, we were watching him scream at Kevin Durant again as they blew the Suns out of the water.
I'm not making a groundbreaking point here, but when you try and look for the greatest players of all time or the best players in the league, a great way to sort of link them all together is their ability to improve season upon season, to add different things to the bow, add different strings to the bow rather. And last year I was so impressed at Ant and just how far the handle had come along. I've said this before, but I've heard James Barlow sort of describe him as when he drives, it looks like he doesn't have a bone in his body. He's able to get down so low and he's able to be so bendy. And to me, last year, it was really Kyrie-esque. And, you make the jokes about him being, 6'6" Steph Curry. I really feel like we're almost looking at 6'6" Kyrie Irving because the shot, like you said, has come along to the point where I think it's 42.3% from three, 9.8 attempts per game. And it's just, Ant must have known that something was coming. He must have known that there would have been more workload on his shoulders. And while he got to 25 points in a sort of different way last year, he's averaging 26.6 this year. And over the course of the last 15, that's 31.3 points per game. Wolves are 10-5 over that stretch, shooting 45% from three, getting to the line 8.4 times per game, 5.7 assists per night as well. It really feels like we're watching a player who is still growing, still age 23. He really might be going supernova. And I think more casual fans might have looked at Ant Edwards last year and thought, this guy's absolutely unstoppable as an offensive force. But your analytics dudes looked and said, well, the true shooting isn't insane. He's not creating the most for his teammates. But now I really think we're starting to look at a really sort of singular offensive force. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out over the course of the season. But we want to sort of branch out and we want to talk about the 5-year plan, essentially. And Andrew, I've got a list of 11 players on the Minnesota roster at the moment, and I've sort of tiered them in long-term importance to me and who I would essentially prioritize keep. So up at the top of the Christmas tree, our shining star, Ant Edwards. I don't care who calls. Elon Musk offers $300 billion for Ant Edwards. I'm still putting down the phone if I want to win a championship. He absolutely can't move. Heart and soul of the team. My next
he might make you more than $300 million too.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, by the time Ant Edwards is done, he's probably going to be able to afford to go to space himself. So why are we accepting that guy's money? But tier two. And this might ruffle some feathers. I've got, in terms of who I would prioritize going forward, I've got Rob Dillingham, I've got Naz Reid, and I've got Nickeil Alexander-Walker as well as my three best fits on the current roster for sort of my long-term view of what should be built around Ant. And we'll get to that as the episode goes along. We're putting on our GM hats. We're trying to basically describe what this team is going to look like. Tell us a little bit about those three guys and maybe how you would rank them, how the organization might rank them in terms of importance going forward. Because I know when we spoke about the Towns trade at the summer, you said this really has been done because Minnesota wants to keep Naz Reid. They want to keep Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And that move basically facilitates that happening in the summer. So how do you feel about those three guys and how do you feel specifically about their fit next to Ant?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think those three are definitely in that next tier. I think if I had to add anyone to that tier, it would be Jaden. But I'm assuming he's probably on the next one after this. Naz and Anthony Edwards just fit together incredibly well. They both play really fast. They're both stretch shooters. Naz can take some of the attacking on ball type of offense where he can create his own shot. Nikhil is a little bit different. He's been this season kind of meshed into this like pseudo point guard role, which isn't ideal for him. But at his best, he is a 3-and-D shooter that can lock down pretty much anybody. And he just kind of has endless energy, which is something that I think is really important having next to Ant, because Ant at sometimes can kind of list off and lose focus. And then Rob, we're kind of seeing lately that Rob is the type of point guard that needs to be with that fits really well with Ant, because one of the things like Chris Finch has really been getting on Edwards and Randall about lately is just because you have a high offensive load doesn't mean you can take plays off on defense. Like, you should take plays off on offense, if anything, because you don't need to have the ball in your hands doing dribble moves and post ups. You can just stand kind of off in the corner, and if you get open, you can get open. And I think that might be the next progression to Ant, to where we're seeing him, because Rob is such a dynamic like scorer, where Ant can just take some time off on offense and unlock his defense a little bit. I think, looking back, like you said, hindsight is always 20/20, but looking back, you can see kind of the thought process with picking Rob when they had Cat and Ant on the roster of like, this is a guy that when those two need a break, he can give you 3 or 4 minutes of just isolation heavy play where he's a great passer and a great scorer, and the offense just doesn't grind to a halt. So those three, I completely agree. I think Nas and Nikhil this offseason are going to be like priority 1 and 1A to re-sign. And then Rob's on a rookie contract, and they're starting to really get him more involved in the rotation. So those all, I agree.
I think one of the reasons why I really loved Rob Dillingham pre-draft was the 2-man game that he developed with Reed Shepherd in Kentucky, basically above the break. And usually when we talk about 2-man game, it might be your Mike Conley, Rudy Gobert style pick and roll. But it's this ability to basically squeeze the defense without even having to penetrate the paint. And at Kentucky, he and Reed were able to move the ball really quickly. And essentially, whoever had the better advantage was there to take it, there to basically run the play. And I really thought, looking at the highlights last night, when Ant and Rob shared the court together, that dynamic was still apparent, where essentially they're both such great threats from above the break, from the 3-point line, that their perimeter defender cannot come over to help. So you essentially guarantee yourself this nice isolation possession for either Rob or Ant. And that's one of the reasons why I really think he's a great fit next to Edwards. And like you said, Andrew, as he sort of comes along, as he can handle more minutes in the NBA, as the body develops, I think we could see more of a dynamic where those two are not only working together in the starting lineup, but maybe Rob takes some primacy at times when, like you say, Ant needs to take a little bit of time off. Ant needs a breather because he's such a great shooter now that, you can just go and put him on the corner and you can basically threaten to do something with him. The defense is going to have to pay attention, and Rob's going to be able to cook up a storm. And then Nikhil is basically if Rob's the fire, Nikhil was the ice. And I think we saw so much of the benefit of having Alexander Walker last year in the playoffs, where that ability to guard 70 feet, basically, that ability to pick up full court, it's really, really useful. And the one worry for me about Dillingham is if you have him starting next to Edwards, are you forcing him to then guard the other team's best perimeter player? And with Nikhil, you're able to avoid that, basically. So we might get to talking about some like 3-guard lineups as the pod carries along. And then, like you said, with Nasri, just a perfect compliment. Go on, Andrew. What were you going to say?
The other thing I was going to just say is Rob. Yeah. I mean, he and Naz Reid have had 21 pick and fade attempts this year, where Rob takes the ball, Naz fades, not shooting 57% on pick and fades with him, and 49% off of passes from Rob in general. So like the Naz Reid, Rob Dillingham connection is fully apparent. Like those two guys love each other. And then to your point, I mean, Rob and Anthony Edwards, it's not even just like a basketball fit. It's like a vibes and personality fit.
Yeah.
Thing. Like they both have very similar, strong, like confident personalities. and they kind of just feed off of each other when they're in the game. Like Rob will do a cool dribble move and the crowd will kind of hush, and then the next play Ant's like, well, I can do something cooler than that, and then dunks on everyone. So it's this really cool dynamic where they just fit well personality wise too.
And then if you talk about Naz, you mentioned his sort of relationship with Rob on the court. That's brilliant. But you ever see those like player A, player B Twitter poll comparisons? Who are you going to take? If you put up Naz Reid's sort of percentages, you'd look and you go like, is this a high 3-point volume shooting wing? Is this like a Trey Murphy III style player? And just the shot that he has developed over the last couple of years, combined with his ability to attack off the bounce, I just think it's amazing that he's able to sort of pack it into that big body. And because he's big, you know, it's just great to have size at the end of the day. We saw that last year with Minnesota. Size is kind of king. If you can have Jaden McDaniels as your small forward, Karl Anthony Towns as your power forward, and Rudy as your center, even if, you know, Karl isn't the best sort of one-on-one defender, it just helps to be really big. And I think that helps Naz as well. So that's why those three are really at my top. And then we really come on to, like you said, Jaden McDaniels, you would have had him in this tier. This to me is the conversation. It's looking at how good Ant is as an offensive force right now, whilst really struggling to produce efficiently sort of at the rim, really struggling to get to the rim this year in comparison to last. 0.56 dunks per game this year in comparison to 0.85. The 2-point percentage is sort of down in general. He's having to develop into this mid-range king. And I think you could have one non-spacer in the lineup long term, but the issue is the other guy that you're paying, you know, $38 million out to 26, 27, 27, 28, Rudy Gobert, also a key figure on this team. So I just struggle to put him in that bracket when I feel like one might need to go for this team to eventually access this ceiling, unless what you want to do is look at Ant and you say, I'm sorry, you're going to be the Allen Iverson of your generation. We're going to give you all the shot attempts per game. It might not be the prettiest thing efficiency-wise, but we trust you to sort of carry us and then raise your level in playoffs, and we're going to be a demon team on the defensive end.
I think for an Ant-led team now, like today and next year, I think he needs a lot of help around him defensively, whether that's Nikhil and Jaden, whether that's Rudy in the center. Ant on ball gets a lot of the credit because those are what goes viral. It's him jawing at Jason Tatum or him picking Ja Morant up full court. And like it kind of hides the truth about Ant that the majority of the game, he's a subpar defender. He kind of goes aloof, loses focus. He's good for 2 back cuts for a dunk a game. And he needs... The flip side of that is, just put Ant on the primary ball handler, but Ant takes it so personally that he runs himself out of steam midway through the third quarter. So where he is now, it's almost like a protecting himself for the next couple of years of, we have Jaden to be like this off-ball menace that has long arms. He can cope and like weak side help when Ant kind of goes aloof. Rudy, I'm less sold on. I don't think he's in their long-term plans more than maybe next year. But Jaden, I think, is, in a perfect world, it is those 5 guys. It is Rob, Ant, Nikhil, Jaden, Naz. And that's the core of this team moving forward. I think everything else is kind of secondary. Maybe Dante is in that, like, picture because he's on a friendly contract. But I think the thought process is Naz Reid has proven he can be good enough defensively. If you're going to have Rob and Ant on a team, you need to have 2 guys that can really make up that defensive mindset almost.
Yeah, sure.
And what's scary is, I mean, last year we were sitting here and we were going like, man, if he can just get a little bit better at shooting that step back 3. And now he's a 40% 3-point shooter. So it could be next year we're sitting here going, well, he's defensive player of the year candidate, and all of that is behind him. That's the scary thing with Anthony Edwards. But I think for me, Jaden has to be in that conversation just for that protection side of it. I also think like Ant, Jaden, and Naz Reid have like a kinship that I think if they were to just, it would have to go through Ant if they're going to trade a Jaden McDaniels. Like they are very, very close friends. Their kids are both 1 year old. Their families are close friends. Basketball fit wise, in a perfect world, Jaden needs to shoot better, but I just don't see them moving on from him for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the player that Ant is going to probably find that is his rival over the next 3, 4, 5 years for the best perimeter player in the league. You have Luka, which is going to park Luka for a second. But if you're talking about Shai Gilgeous-Alexander in OKC, he is a player that is a positive defender, but he has a specialized role where he never has to guard the other team's best player. He's actually this off-ball hawk. So it's interesting. There's like this little reverse thing going along where Ant is actually a phenomenal on-ball defender, like you said, the sort of picking up full court, really harassing and haranguing some of the best players in the league. But it's just, he can fall asleep a little bit off ball. But when you look at the insulation that Shai has in OKC, take your pick, Alex Caruso, Jalen Williams, Chet Holmgren, Lou Dort, he's never having to take on an assignment that he's not comfortable with. And at the moment, you do have that where, like you said, Jaden McDaniels can be the guy to guard the big wing defender, so Ant doesn't have to do it. Big wing offensive player, so Ant doesn't have to do it. Nikhil or Dante could be the guy to guard the other team's best perimeter guard. So you have that. It's just this thing with spacing. And I actually went to play-by-play stats before we started recording this, and I looked at the numbers for when Ant, Rudy and Julius either share or don't share the court. And when Ant, Rudy and Julius are on the court together, this is all in games where it's just those guys play. They all had to have been healthy in those games. They basically have a +2 net rating. When it's Ant or Julius, they have a +6.1 net rating. That's without Rudy Gobert. When it's Ant and Rudy without Julius, they have a +6.7 net rating. So it really sort of illustrates the point. You can cope with one non-spacer. You can cope with one shaky shooter. It's when we start to add more and more into the mix that we get to this point where it's like there's diminishing returns on how good you can be as a defensive team, because the offense skyrockets without Rudy on the court and the defense is phenomenal without Julius on the court. So it's just a difficult one to sort of pass out, really.
That's kind of the conundrum with this whole team is, like, when people are hitting shots, they look like they could win a championship this year. When people aren't hitting shots, it is ugly basketball to watch. And really the only constant has been Anthony Edwards. But to your point, I do think like this year, that's going to be a problem. I mean, Finch already started not closing with one of those two. Naz Reid is pretty much closing any important game now, and either Rudy or Randall, whoever is having the worst game, is off the court. He kind of does the same thing with Mike Conley. I mean, Mike got benched, Dante got injured, Mike's back in the starting lineup, but it's really like a coin flip on whoever's playing better between Mike and Nikhil, which is like a luxury for him in some ways. I think long-term, that's going to be the struggle, is if Jaden McDaniels can't be like a 37, 38% three-point shooter consistently, that's where it's going to get ugly. I just think they would, where the team is now, I think they would prefer to have Jaden out there than Rudy. And I think that's going to, as time goes on, and Rudy is, I mean, he just signed a contract extension, but as he ages probably less gracefully as a 7'3" center, I think that's where we're going to see, okay, we need to figure out, is Jaden, can he play power forward next to Naz? Is Rudy going to come off the bench? Do we need to trade Rudy? What's the next step? But I think that'll come first before they start talking Jaden trades.
Just to say my final bit of play-by-play data for the episode, in 200 minutes with Ant Edwards, Julius Randle, and Naz Reid sharing the court without either Rudy Gobert or Jaden McDaniels, the Minnesota Timberwolves have a plus 15.5 net rating and a 127 offensive rating. So that would just be the argument for, if you want to pivot and if you want to go away from this idea of we are aiming to be one of the best defenses in the league, very small sample size, maybe Ant in an offensively slanted lineup can carry you to a top offense in the league. I don't know about you, Andrew, but maybe that's a little bit more fun to watch. I don't know. Like, maybe we just really see like, exactly how far can we push it. And that's still with Julius on the court. But I completely get what you're saying. And it's really good to sort of hear the color, hear the word on the street when you're saying Ant and Jaden McDaniels are like that. Both kids the same age. It's essentially you've got to go and kiss the Don's finger and ask his permission if you want to move off with Jaden McDaniels.
Yeah, which is just, it's tough. And the thing that's tough with Jaden too is he is like, he puts in the work. He is like a solid shooter at times. Like, he will have games where he goes 6 for 7 and is just letting them fly. The frustrating part with Jaden is it's just so inconsistent, and there's a lot more of those down times than there are the upsides. I mean, just bringing up his basketball reference, 33.5% this year, 33.7% last year, 39.8% in 2022-23. I think they're offensively, they're still holding on to that 2022-23 season of, if Jaden can just shoot above average, this opens up so much for the offense.
Even if you can just have him in that sort of corner crasher role where he's credible as a corner 3-point shooter, you're not asking him to do bits above the break. It's, can you be our Aaron Gordon, essentially? Can you be our guy that is always there for the alley-oop attempt? Can you be fairly reliable from the corners? Can you be sort of Bruce Bowen in the 2020s? That's something that I think could work. It's just with this sort of mangled spacing, there are too many guys that want the corner. There are too many guys that you can help off of. So I think what we're getting to is this idea that Ant can facilitate one non-spacer and you can still have a really, really good offensive team. We're leaning away from Rudy long term, which I think is interesting considering the length of the contract, considering the resources that they invested to sort of get him through the door. And I asked you before the pod, like, do you wish they traded Rudy over the summer instead of Cat? And your answer was pretty interesting. What did you say on that? Because this wasn't an answer that I expected.
I truly don't think there was any trade value for Rudy. I think if they were going to move Rudy as opposed to Cat, it would have had to be at the expense of the first round pick this year. I think it's interesting with Rudy Gobert because any team that has him, I mean, Jazz Twitter for years was Rudy Gobert defenders. Wolves Twitter right now is Rudy Gobert defenders. Analytics people are Rudy Gobert defenders. The rest of the NBA, the 29 teams that don't have Rudy Gobert, I don't think value him very much. I mean, we even heard it from like Julius and Dante when they got traded here. Like, one of Dante's first like press conferences, he was like, I had no idea Rudy Gobert was like this good. Like, it doesn't make sense that he's like this good of a player. And I think that translates. I mean, and I think now where Rudy Gobert's kind of having his worst season since, I mean, maybe even like 2017, if you look at like his points per game, rebounds per game, just how kind of ugly some of this has been. He's being called out by Finch almost every game for like not rebounding aggressively. I think he's kind of in that untradeable albatross where even if you threw the Detroit pick on now, you're kind of stuck with him. But I don't think that there was ever an option to trade him. And what's hard with that is, again, looking at the apron things, they looked at Rudy Gobert's next year with his player option of 40-something million, and they extended him for, I think he's getting 25 million a year. So next year it shaves 15. It gets them under the first apron. Like it, what's that?
Sorry, Andrew, to say 35 next year in 25, 26.
35. So they shaved a little bit off of his salary with the extension.
Yep.
And I'm trying to think if it wasn't, I think it would have been like 46 million because I'm looking at what he's making this year and it's 43.8. So they shaved about 10 million off, which helps them get under the second apron. I guess I get the thought process with that, but it really has handcuffed them with Rudy because I don't think you can pay Rudy Gobert $35 million to come off the bench. And if you can't trade him and he's signed to a long-term contract, what are your options?
Step up the Phoenix Suns, little Bradley Beal, Rudy Gobert trade. Once you're below the second apron, I'm looking round. I genuinely am. I'm looking, and I thought, oh, maybe Dallas could be a team that sort of takes the flyer on him if they don't get over that hump in the postseason this year. But then they've got Derek Lively. Why are you going to bring in Rudy Gobert when you have the guy that's been criticizing him since the start of his career? Parking the trade stuff just for a second. I just want to get one thing clear. Andrew, the big issue with Rudy, it's not the defensive versatility. It's not the rim protection. It's not anything like that. And he's often been called out, particularly by the media, for, oh, he got cooked on an island by Luka Doncic. Guess what? Everyone gets cooked on an island by Luka Doncic. Yeah. It's the lack of offensive versatility, right? That's what really, if you are a Rudy hater, that's what you should be focusing on, not the fact that he can't switch on to Damian Lillard on a regular basis.
It's the lack of offensive versatility. I mean, he is purely a pick and roll big. You could even categorize him as like a pick and roll lob big. Like, he is not very good at catching pocket passes. He's not very good at catching chest passes, very good at catching lobs. So he is a incredibly specialized offensive player. And when you have somebody that specialized, the thing that also goes like kind of under the radar is there's not a lot of players in the NBA that are used to playing with that specialized of an offensive player. In like the mid 2000s, I think a lot of point guards were used to pick and roll bigs that can only catch lobs, and they kind of made do with it. Nowadays, I mean, it's Rudy Gobert, Clint Capella, Derek Lively, and that might be the list. I mean, Zubac, I guess, but it takes an adjustment period for a point guard, shooting guard, ball handler to learn how to play with him. And if you're going to trade for a guy making $38 million, your defense will get significantly better just by him existing on the court. But your offense is going to take a massive hit, and everyone's going to have to kind of learn how to fit in around Rudy, because you can't mesh Rudy into different schemes. He just doesn't have the skill set to all of a sudden stand at the nail and, be a free throw line threat or be able to catch mid ranges. We've seen his floaters. They're not great. Yeah. Like, you kind of have to change the whole offensive philosophy to fit him just to get your defense. I mean, elite. He will make your defense incredibly good just by breathing.
And yeah, it feels like a philosophy that's just becoming a tad outdated, which is probably the issue, right? Like 3-4 years ago, when the Utah Jazz were threatening to win like 70 games a season, it made sense because the league was so pick and roll heavy. All you needed was that 7-foot roller, and then Nikola Jokic comes along. The Golden State Warriors continue to sort of influence teams. Sacramento picks it up with Sabonis, and more bigs than not are really running this like handoff elbow action now. They're running delay at the top of the key. Even Anthony Davis, like one of the best rim runners in history, JJ Redick's gone in there and he said, no, I think we need to make you more of a central part of our offense. We need to put the ball in your hands. And unfortunately, if the ball is in Rudy Gobert's hands, there's a little bit of an issue for your offense. You just either want him playing dunker spot or you want him as that pick and roll player. I'm looking, maybe Charlotte could take a chance on him because I think LaMelo's such an offensive threat and such a deep offensive threat that he could maybe like ballast that and that could work together. Maybe Atlanta, but this isn't the Rudy Gobert trade episode. This is the building around Ant Edwards episode. So now that we've established that maybe Rudy, in our minds, isn't long for this team, What kind of big would you want to see play in this new core? Because are you envisioning Naz Reid as your 5? Are you envisioning someone else coming in?
So this is where it's kind of difficult because we've never seen Anthony Edwards without like a dominant big. Even when Cat was the lone center, there was a Jared Vanderbilt that played kind of that defensive intensity pick and roller guy. They've never just had a spread it out offense. So to me, that's where I would like to go, is just maybe your defense is 10 to 15th and you have a bunch of perimeter guys that are great, but Naz Reid is the center of this team moving forward. The other thing that I think we've learned this season is that Jaden McDaniels can play power forward. When he plays power forward, he rebounds very well. His intensity is really good. He's put on a lot of muscle to be able to like stand up to those guys. And he is an exceptional, like weak side defensive, like menace. When he is playing power forward and he can crash in on help defense, he is phenomenal. So to me, and I'll say the other side of it first is that Finch is an offensive coach. And I think he has been kind of handed this team that is very defense heavy, but I have never really bought that Finch wants to play a defense heavy scheme. I've always kind of had the interpretation that he wants to play a Golden State Warrior, beautiful game, switch at all 5 positions, like lots of pick and rolls that just, you know, drive and kicks off ball.
Yeah.
That's what Finch runs, like, I think in his dreams.
Yeah.
And I think that's where this future is eventually going to go, is where Naz is your 5, Jaden's your 4, either Nikhil or Dante is your 3, Ant stays as kind of your 2, and then Rob is your 1 that you hide on whoever you can. But it gives you that 2 through 5 switchability. It gives you space. Every one of them theoretically can be a shooter. And then it's just a lot of off-ball stuff and Anthony Edwards kind of running the show.
I think this is where the Detroit pick comes in. Currently mocked to be 17th in the draft. So sort of a mid first rounder, which is, you know, we've seen plenty of value sort of being had at that stage through the draft in the last couple of years. And I think what we're both sort of saying is that if Minnesota chooses to keep that pick, we'll have a discussion on whether they should choose to keep it or attach it to someone to try and get a more veteran player in. But if they choose to keep it, they should draft a big, right? Because I'm sort of looking and I'm thinking what you described makes sense, where it's more of like that 3-guard lineup. I'd also like to maintain the flexibility where it can be one perimeter guy, whether that be Rob, Dante, Nikhil next to Ant, and then you basically just have as your wings Jaden McDaniels and Naz Reid, because with Naz's shooting threat, it doesn't matter if he's your nominal 4, if he's your nominal 3, he's just sort of a really, really good basketball player. You can still insulate Jaden McDaniels, and then maybe you get in a 5 that's not earning $40 million a year, that maybe has a little bit more offensive talent than Rudy Gobert. He doesn't have to be like this world-beating defender or anything, but I would really love to see them target a big man so they can become a little bit more diverse in the front court. What are your thoughts on that pick? And have you heard sort of anything around the organization about what they might look for? Can we sort of infer from who they've drafted in the past, who Tim Connolly's drafted in the past, what kind of player is really going to float their boat?
First, I'm just going to say Luka Garza had a really good game against Utah. Luka Garza is not the answer. And there is a very large subset of Timberwolves Twitter that every time Rudy Gobert or Julius Randle struggles, it's why isn't Luka Garza playing? It's because like they see him in practice every day. He's a very good, skilled offensive big. He's not the answer here. In my perfect world, I think they would attach the Detroit pick and try and move Rudy this offseason, right? If they're able to. I don't know if that's doable. I also don't know if that's something the Wolves feel comfortable doing yet, because Rudy does, to his credit, he plays every night. He is intense every night. And I think it's important for guys like Rob, Ants, Terrence Shannon, younger guys to see a veteran that just plays hard every night, I think does help them. And Rudy is still fine. He's not $45 million, $35 million fine, but he's fine. So if that's not an option, I do agree with you drafting a backup big. I think historically speaking, they haven't really drafted bigs. Leonard Miller, I know you're one of the last guys on Leonard Miller Island, but he hasn't really panned out very well.
Andrew,
outside of that,
just to come in super quickly, as you said that, I literally looked up Leonard Miller's G League stats like 30 seconds ago. I was ready to go like, oh, could this be the guy? But no, carry on. I know.
Yeah. Leonard Miller and Josh Minot have the same problem. They don't need to come in and play offensively good basketball if they're going to get minutes this year. They need to play really strong defensive basketball. And both of them have very eye-opening lapses. Even Leonard Miller in the G League just has moments where it's like he's playing a different game plan. And I think that's preventing him from being even a thought this season. Okay, back to if they do draft a big, I do think they need to draft another kind of stretch big, more so than like a Rudy Gobert backup. If Rudy can't be traded, they got to bring in a guy that can at least play alongside Rudy, play with Nas, add more spacing to the floor, and can at least shoot a little bit. I think Emmett and I were on one of your shows before the draft, and I will completely admit I don't pay any attention to college basketball until after I find out who they drafted. So I couldn't even throw a name at you, but that would be the architect act I think they would go for is let's get a guy out here that can space the floor, play with Rudy or Nas. Nas is probably the starting four next year, and then this guy kind of fills in that Nas Reed spot.
Yeah, I'd agree. Or just sort of have the optionality to go small, to go big. Like Nas, like we're saying, is a phenomenal player, but doesn't necessarily have to play 35 minutes a night. So you can sort of have your Dallas dynamic where you've got two almost starting level bigs, hopefully long term, and they both get to play like 24, 25 minutes a night as opposed to really burdening one player.
They also have a log jam at guard. I mean, Mike Conley is signed through next season. He's going to get minutes next year just because he is the dad of this team. Rob Dillingham is going to get minutes. Dante is. Nikhil is. And then Terrence Shannon Jr. has looked awesome. Like they really are high on him. At some point, he's going to need to get minutes too. And then Anthony Edwards takes up an entire 40 minutes a night, and Jaden still needs minutes. So I think if they were to draft another guard, it would be, it would just kind of be a waste. Because, I mean, Jalen Clark, we'll bring up him quick because I had an article come out on him today. But like he's played the last two nights, and he has been phenomenal. Just in his like 25 minutes or so, he's been awesome. So they would need to use that pick on a big. Again, my preference would be try to move off of that Rudy salary and give yourself more options, but I just don't know if the team is ready to do that.
I think the other question with regards to that big is, do they need to be able to take on any sort of playmaking load? So there's one thing in sort of being able to stretch, maybe being able to park that guy in the corner. We're not going to go and do a little draft segment. If you want to follow the draft, Karma Maluak is the top rated big in this class. Asa Newell is a really interesting player who can sort of play the 4-5, who I think might be the perfect guy, but we're not going to talk about him today. Forget about specific players. Would you want to see in an ideal world a player that could potentially develop a two-man game with Ant? Someone almost like a Sabonis, like a Şengün, like a, obviously ideal world, just pair him with Nikola Jokic and you're fine. Or do you think that Ant has become sufficiently primary and sufficiently good at playmaking to the point where you can just say, no, we can have a role player big as long as he can space, and just let Ant cook and get out of the way, basically.
It's a tough question because as Ant stands this season, he still needs that big to kind of set him up sometimes. Like he needs the Rudy Gobert screen. He needs the 2-man game with Julius. Like he's not to that point yet. I think what's scary for the future with Anthony Edwards is that every hole that has been identified in his game, he comes back the next year and it is a strength. It is this weird, I mean, he was not a shooter when he got drafted. That was like the biggest. Now he is quite literally putting up Steph Curry and James Harden MVP numbers from shooting. I mean, like you said last year with the handle, that was a really big critique of like, oh, is this guy going to just be Jaylen Brown and really struggle driving, like dribble driving? He spent an entire offseason on it and made his handle elite to where he has step back game, he has drive game, he can make spin moves, he has post work, he has everything you could think of in terms of dribbling. So it's hard to say what the future will look like for him because he's so fluid in just what he is able to learn how to do in one off season. But right now he still needs that pick and roll partner. So if they were to draft somebody this upcoming off season, I think they would probably prioritize is this guy able to do like dribble handoffs? Is this guy a good pick and fade player? Does he bring a little bit of ball handling in his game? And maybe not focus so much on the defensive side of it. I think 3 or 4 years from now, we could be living in a world where Anthony Edwards is an entire offense in himself. And as long as you got a secondary creator and shooters, that's all you need.
I mean, just to remind listeners, last 15 games, and this is despite like not having ideal spacing, 31.3 points per game, 45% on 10 3 attempts per game, 8.4 visits to the line, nearly 6 assists, nearly 6 rebounds, a steal a game, nearly a block a game as well. That's the kind of stat line you talk about. And, those 3 little letters, MV, what? It's, I mean, starting to get to that category where I know that Ant had a little bit of chat last year where it was like, oh, maybe if he really sort of takes the league by storm again, we could really be talking about an MVP. But the numbers never used to be there. It used to be like it jumped off the page when you watched him, but then you go and look at the stat line, it's like, oh, it's 25 points on reasonable efficiency. But I think we might get to a stage where if the lane is opened up a little bit, if he can fully access the 2-point land again, instead of having to take these really tough mid-ranges, instead of having to take nearly 50% of his shots from 3, if he can finally get to the rim that little bit more, you might be looking at that complete offensive force. And he's sort of following on of this lineage of Kawhi Leonard's another one of these guys who just improved exponentially. I had Dylan Huntsinger on the podcast a couple of times last year, Thunder Chaps for those who don't know him. And I remember laughing because I did like a pre-season pod with him on Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. And it was the year after he first made All-NBA first team. And I was like, I think, with Chet back, with Jalen, he might get a little better on the court, but his numbers are going to dip because he's not quite going to have the usage. And Dylan sat there and he was like, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander gets a lot better every single season. And he just made All-NBA first team. And I sort of thought, all right, this is what happens when you talk to a guy and I love Dylan, he's really, really smart in his analysis. This is what happens when you talk to a guy who is a Kentucky fan and an OKC Thunder fan. He's going to have this opinion about Shai. And then here I am, pie on my face 2 seasons later, as he has got way better every season. The rate of improvement has continued. So it's really a question of what the hell are we going to be looking at in a couple of years with Ant?
I mean, he has the potential where I think he could be a 50, 40, 90 guy that's scoring 35 a game. I mean, he's 5% away on on field goal percentage and 8% on free throw. I mean, he could be like, it's hard to even comp him out to the future. Like you were saying with James Harden, like there is that aspect of his game, but he also has this violence to him where he can make up his mind where he is going to dunk it, and it doesn't matter. Like he just decides he's going to do these things. So then it's like, is he Vince Carter? I mean, Vince Carter doesn't have a fraction of the handle that Ant has or the shooting ability. So then, like Dwayne Wade, he was being compared to. Well, Dwayne Wade's never shot even close to 40% from three. So it's,
you hate to say it, it is Kobe, really, isn't it?
It's Kobe.
It's Kobe.
And the stories that come out of that locker room is Kobe stuff, where Jalen Clark is talking about like how he like left to go home after a Denver playoff game and came back the next morning, and Ant was like still working covered in sweat, like screaming at his trainer. It's this type of stuff where it's Kobe, but like very friendly.
I don't know what Ant would make of that. Like, is that what the night marketing team is going to go for next? They've done some phenomenal stuff around him. Like,
I don't know,
but very friendly.
I mean, very personable, funny, friendly guy. But then you hear stories about him, and it's like first guy in, last guy out, works constantly, has a team of trainers with him. He doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't really party. Plays Xbox a lot, but like who doesn't nowadays?
Yeah.
So it's just kind of like he can be Kobe, which if he's Kobe, I mean, 4 MVPs and 5 championships starts to become the standard.
Yeah, let's see. I really think the sky is the limit with this guy, and I think before we get out of here, especially because it's a week before the trade deadline, we'd be remiss to not do this as podcasters, Andrew.
Yes.
Anything that's jumped out, any potential targets for Minnesota? Is it going to be quiet? Let's say you're in Tim Connolly's shoes. Anyone that you'd be targeting if you're trying to get off the Julius Randle deal?
So if I was trying to get off the Julius Randle deal, I would be targeting a backup big and a wing you can roll the dice on. And it would have to come kind of in a 3-team trade, or you'd have to do some like money working magic. But one that I've really liked is if you can somehow get like Robert Williams and Matisse Thybulle from Portland and dump Randall somewhere else. Robert Williams could, Naz Reid slides in as starting 4. Robert Williams can be your backup rim runner. Matisse Thybulle, if he's nothing, he's nothing. If he can work out something, he's something. The other thing that's hard with that scenario is the Wolves have to target guys that are on either 1 or 2 year deals that either expire this year, or they could flip as an expiring to still open up room for Naz and Nikhil. So unfortunately, I've been pretty vocal on, I just don't think they're going to get anything at the deadline. The other guys on this team that are like, trade people that would be like looked at for a trade are Jaden McDaniels. But then you look at his contract, and if you're trading Jaden out and going to kind of break up the Ant Jaden thing, are you going to get a player back at 20 something million that is considerably better than Jaden, that is worth rocking the boat? I couldn't really find anyone. Nikhil makes $4.5 million on an expiring. With second apron rules, you can't take any money back or any extra money back. So looking at guys that make under $4.5 million, you're looking at like mid first round picks. Like probably not.
Yeah.
It's just really hard. So I think my headspace with the Wolves is this is their team for the rest of the year. This offseason will be kind of exciting for them. But I would just stand pat, especially how they played in January and February. Again, for anyone that's made it an hour and 2 minutes into the pod, the Wolves have 8 of their first 10 games at home, including 5 in a row. January, they finished with a winning record despite playing 4 games in 6 days twice. they have a chance here in February to really rattle off 7 out of the next 10 games as a win and get themselves back into that 4 or 5 seed conversation.
It's going to be really exciting to watch. And I do wonder, like, we speak about Julius as this guy that maybe you have to move off, but he has been sort of a positive for this team this year. Like, I feel like he's suffering from the fact that he's just not Karl Anthony Towns. He's not the best 7-foot shooter, maybe aside from like Dirk Nowitzki, of all time. He has still been useful. He has integrated a little bit more where he can operate off ball. I've liked seeing some of like the cuts to the basket. I've liked seeing him and Ant working together. It's not just been 12-second ISOs every time like he gets the ball. It doesn't just stop with him. So I do think that they should probably keep him around because, like you said, Andrew, what are they really going to get back for Julius Randle?
Yeah.
If you're looking to move him, every team in the league knows that they'll give you players that aren't going to factor into your playoff rotation. It's just if you're really scared of him taking that player option and then not being able to move him next year.
Which Julius is an interesting player because if I think that someone will give him like 3 years 90, 2 years 80. Like the Nets have a ton of money. Detroit's going to have money. I think someone will pay him.
Right.
I don't worry about the option as much. And I think if he does take the option, that's just where the Detroit pick is used, is just let's get him to a place where he can sign an extension and do right by him. And then we'll just reset with Nas next year.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Guys, if you've taken anything away from this podcast, it's that keep your eyes locked on the Minnesota Timberwolves. Keep your eyes locked on Anthony Edwards every single night. And make sure that you're reading Andrew as well. I genuinely read his stuff whenever I see it pop up across my timeline. He does great work. He's getting really close to those Timberwolves guys. You've been invited to any parties yet, Andrew? You partying with
parties
Rudy yet?
No parties yet. I've gotten some like one-on-one stuff with them where they're interesting guy. Jack, you'll be there at some point when you're not living across the pond. You'll have your credentials and you'll be covering an NBA team. And I tell you, the last 15 minutes of practice when media can kind of check in and just watch, there's nothing funnier than like Joe Ingles, Luka Garza, and Julius Randle doing shooting competitions. It's just, there's nothing better than it. It's just an angry Australian yelling at two quiet guys.
There you go. That's your peek behind the curtain. And make sure you're following Andrew because, yeah, you genuinely put up some really good stuff, whether it's the written work, whether it's the post-game interviews, the training stuff. So, yeah, keep it locked on the Timberwolves. Keep it locked on Andrew. Keep it locked on the drop step. I hope you've got a better idea of how the Timberwolves have not closed their championship window, how Anthony Edwards could ascend to, really, really scary levels still. We sort of buried the lead this season with the spacing struggles, but once everything opens up for that guy, the sky really is the limit on the offensive end. So it's going to be great to watch. Make sure you're following both me and Andrew when we're covering it, and make sure you are enjoying the rest of the NBA season. Thank you for listening to this podcast. All links down below for checking out Andrew, and yeah, tune back in for your next episode. Cheers.